Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tapestry webinar. I've got myself here, Jack, from the education team at Tapestry, and I'm joined by my colleague, Stephen.
I'm also on the education team at Tapestry. We thought it was a good opportunity and good timing, really, to discuss progress and how we can use Tapestry to support the communication to our senior leadership teams, our managers, around how well our children have been doing. I'd say traditionally at this time of year, there might have been data drops, or whatever we want to call them, where there'd start to be analysis of how our children were progressing. So we thought it was timely, really, to start talking about what you could be doing instead. So I thought it would be a good place to start, Jack, if you could sort of just remind us of some of the general changes on Tapestry, considering the reforms in the early years.
So there's loads, isn't there? We've made quite a lot of changes over the past year. The biggest one, well, maybe not the biggest one, but one of the biggest ones was we've now got flags. So with the introduction of the new EYFS and development matters and birth to 5 matters and the way that we put that on Tapestry, we've now got a flag system. So it's essentially you just flag the area of learning in your observation, which is a lot more straightforward than the age bands and refinements and things like that was previously there. With that, we also developed what we call the areas of concern screen, which is kind of what we're using for the monitoring, which we're going to go into much more detail today. And not a feature that we developed for this new framework, but one we developed, I can't remember, quite a few months before this, is reflections. But it links very heavily with the new system, which we'll talk about again today as well. And I think that's roundabout.
Yeah, I think that's all the relevant stuff, really. And I think it's useful to just sort of clarify that on that areas of concern screen, when we're talking about concerns, I think it's really important that we're talking about our concerns about our provision and not labeling children as concerns. And that's not what it's about at all. It's about considering our provision, how the children are accessing it, and what tweaks we need to make, really, and what adjustments we need to make to our provision.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the reflections tool then ties in really, really nicely with that. But again, we'll discuss that moving forward today.
Definitely. So one of the first things I want to talk to you about, Stephen, because you have experience in this area, the challenge facing senior leaders, managers with these particular changes that have happened with the new EYFS this year.
Yeah, I think realistically, the word that sort of springs to mind is accountability and being able to talk confidently about progress in your nursery or reception class. And obviously, when things change, it can induce a level of fear and panic that, well, if I don't have that information, that data to say that 80% of our children are making good progress, or whatever measures you're using, or what percentage are on track, then you inevitably are going to worry about what you're going to do instead. And it might be that you need to report to the local authority, or you need to report to your governors, or you need to probably the greatest fear, a visit from Ofsted. How am I going to justify that our progress is outstanding? So yeah, it's firstly, I think it's important to say that it's understandable that there is a bit of a worry from leadership teams. And I think realistically, until every setting's had an Ofsted visit and can trust that they're not going to get asked for a sheet of data, or which Ofsted have made it really clear that they're not going to be asking for that information. But I think, like I said, realistically, there is going to be nervousness until everyone's been through the process at least once and can trust that that's the case and has a better understanding of what it's going to look like instead.
Definitely. So how can leaders know that progress is outstanding without all this data? Because obviously you mentioned that there was kind of a reliability on that in the past, and the big change is that it's kind of all gone now. So how do we know that this progress is happening? How do we know it's outstanding without this data?
Well, there's been a real shake-up in the sort of advice for early years settings in the way that we're assessing, and I think it's really healthy. Personally, as an ex-senior leader, as an ex-early years leader, I've been through this process a bit earlier because I worked in specialist schools, and we sort of changed our assessment procedures a little bit earlier, realistically, and moved away from data about 5 years ago. So I've experienced the change, and I've experienced Ofsted come in, and it really is about sort of a complete mindset shift that we've spoken about in these webinars before, that we need to change our assessment procedures altogether. And realistically, what I've been saying for the last 5 years is, if you are asked that question, that sort of fear-inducing question of how do you know that progress is outstanding in your setting, whoever's asking that question, I would always be keen to come back with, I know progress is outstanding because my provision is outstanding. And it's sort of a reinvestment of time. I see it as that time that I used to spend 2 or 3 weeks of the year, I'd say, analysing data, and it was painful. But it was for that purpose. So when Ofsted finally came 2 or 3 years down the line, I'd be able to say, look at this. This tells me that our children are making outstanding progress. And it's reinvesting that time and energy into, okay, how can we possibly improve our provision? How can we make it even better? How can we ensure all our children are engaged and all our children are learning? And if you get to that point where you are confident through whatever means that your provision is outstanding, then you can confidently say, well, progress is going to be outstanding as a result of the efforts you've put into your provision and the thought processes that you've been through. And I think it's so important that we're having more conversations about progress on a day-to-day basis. And it was such a healthy change for me when I started having those regular informal and formal discussions with staff about the progress that our children were making. And the only really level of formality in it was that I'd be tracking in the end was which children are not accessing the provision in the way that we would like them to, which children are not making the progress which we would expect them to. And then obviously from that, having a set of actions to say, okay, so there's 6 children in the early years across a variety of areas who are not making the progress that we would like them to. What are we going to do about it? So it might be that at October half term, we've had that first sort of semi-formal discussion really about these children. And realistically, the identification, especially in that first term, is probably quite a bit earlier than that. But those conversations are ongoing between team members, between leadership and teachers and support staff. But at some point, having sort of semi-regular formal discussions about, okay, so we're identifying that this group of children are struggling to access whatever area of curriculum area we're discussing. And then to sort of track those children really in the sense of, and I'm not saying track percentages or age bands, I'm saying, okay, these 6 children are struggling to access our provision. So what are our actions to ensure that by Christmas, that number of children is reduced, And realistically, because you are saying that the rest, all the other children are accessing your provision appropriately, that should mean that they are all making good progress. It's a knock-on. If they're engaged in their learning and what you are providing for them and your interactions and the activities that they are engaging in are all appropriate and everything's going well, then they should be making good progress. And as a leader, you are expecting the staff who are working with those children to be able to verbalize that and tell you, okay, well, when this child started in September, this is what they could do in terms of whether it's a mark making or anything to do with shape, space and measure or the counting, whatever it is, this is what they were doing then, and this is what they are doing now. And to dig a bit deeper as a leader, to ask that question, well, what have you done to impact that learning? What did you provide? What sort of interactions did you have? How have you enhanced that learning for that child? And these are questions that we need to be thinking about on a day-to-day level in the room we're working with the children in, is how am I enhancing learning through my role, so that we can confidently have those conversations with team members and leadership teams. So I'd be looking to say, I want to have really regular discussions with my staff about progress and what it looks like. And I started this little section by saying it really impacted my role in the sense that I no longer was spouting data about progress. I was actually spouting useful information. And if I bumped into a parent and said, oh, it's wonderful about the progress that your child's made with, whether it's holding a knife and fork or whatever it is, I knew sort of snippets of real progress information. It sort of changed everything, really. And it was so much more valuable. And that's not to say that I could tell the specific learning story for every child in my setting, but I knew who could, and I knew snippets, and I knew which children I had concerns about the provision for. I knew that information. And if you ask me which children do we need to make some adjustments for, I knew that information. But realistically, I had some actual genuine progress discussions in my bank that I could pull out and talk about. And then it made the likes of review meetings and progress meetings so much more beneficial, really. So it was a much better system to be working in.
Yeah.
But as we've said, it was a significant change from what we were doing before. And it took time to implement and get the systems and tweak them and make sure they were right.
Yeah. But it sounds like a really positive change in that setting for sure. So, Stephen, you mentioned you worked in specialist provision. Given what you just said, is it any different for children with learning differences?
I don't think it is really, Jack, to be honest. I think the mindset should be the same, that we are getting to know our children as best as we possibly can, trying to ensure that every child is engaged in their learning and making progress. And if they are not accessing our provision effectively, then we need to do something about it, regardless of whether a child is developing typically or has learning differences. So I would say we should be treating the children all in the same way in that regard. And I think it's an interesting point around the areas of concern screen that, and we've said this loads of times, but just because a child has learning differences should not mean they are a concern all the way through the year.
Yeah.
A child with learning differences can be making amazing progress for them or for anyone. It's just brilliant progress. That is not concerning. They are accessing your provision. They are progressing really well. We can all talk about that progress. We're involving the family and any other professionals, and we're just really happy with the progress a child is making. And conversely, one of our children who we envisage is going to be flying along and is making outstanding progress for the first term in nursery or in reception, and then all of a sudden there's a little bit of a dip. They're still going to achieve the early learning goal in June or July, but something's changed and they're not accessing the provision anymore in the way that they were. And that's concerning, like for you as a teacher and for your provision. What needs to change? What conversations need to be had? Do we need to try and enhance the engagement with the family at home? And do we need to, what do we need to do, really? And again, it's an opportunity to use the reflections, which is what we're going to be talking about pretty soon. So, yeah, I wouldn't be considering that you'd need to do anything different. Now, there are obviously additional sort of frameworks and resources available, and they can be really helpful, especially if you've got inexperienced staff teams or you're working with a child who's at a level that you've not encountered before. So those things are available, and we've got the Cherry Garden branch maps on Tapestry, but they're not the be all and end all. They're a useful supporting framework or guidance document, but realistically, the principles are exactly the same. Consider where the child is, consider what's most important for them to learn next, really, and how are you going to facilitate that?
Yeah, that was really well put. I think the biggest thing, and we're going to look more at it now on Tapestry, but I think that what made it really click for me is it's this shift to thinking about your provision instead of thinking about points on a scale and numbers and percentages and things like that. And I think once you kind of have that change of mindset, not only does it make more sense on Tapestry, but it makes more sense in general in the context of the new EYFS and the new documents and things like that.
Yeah, and there needs to be that confidence, Jack, I think, from the leadership team or the manager that, I am really confident that this provision is outstanding and it's meeting the needs of every child.
Yeah.
And this is what we've done to ensure that that's happening. And observations and obviously key observations of how the children are engaging and interacting with the provision, and regular discussions, and just seeking that high quality all the time. I think it is really important. Do you want to share your screen, Jack, and show us practically some of the useful things that we might be able to use on the areas of concern screen?
Yeah. So let's have a little look at Tapestry in itself. So I mentioned at the beginning, obviously we've got the flags now, which I'm not going to go into in this video because we've got quite a few other resources which cover them. But it's essentially we just on your observations, when you make an observation, you're flagging the area of learning or the aspect it relates to if you're using birth to 5 that you're seeing. Basically, that this is what you're observing, and it's to do with communication and language. It's as easy as that. And then when you make that flag and you save that observation, it then links into this areas of concern screen, which we've had a look at before. So let's have a look at it again. Here it's in it's tracking EYFS 2021, and then it's here, areas of concern screen. You've got two ways. You've got the guided view and the group view. We're going to have a look at the group view today because this, I think, will be more in the context of if you're having a discussion with your SLT member. I think this screen is probably the one that we're going to look at more often. So let's have a look at this. So this is what you'll see first. And this table at the top is a really good starter. This is your totals table. So let's say I'm meeting with you, Stephen, as a member. You're my SLT, and we're having a sort of, well, one of those professional conversations about the children in my class. I'm going to show you this screen. What would you want to know, or what's interesting to you from an SLT point of view on this screen, do you think?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm probably looking at those concerns I can see, particularly in PSED. You've got 4 concerns there. So there's 4 children that you have sort of concerns in that area. You've also got in mathematics, you've got mathematical development, you've got a higher number of concerns there. But realistically, I'd sort of want to be digging into all of those and learning a bit more myself about them. But I'd also, as a leader, really be wanting to sort of pick out some children who you've identified as not being a concern at all. And I'd like you to tell me about their progress as well, because it's important that I have an understanding of the processes that you've got in place. And I want you to be able to confidently communicate that to me. So tell me about a different child who you've highlighted as having no concerns at all. So I'm imagining that child's making really good progress. Is that the case? Can you tell me about some of the key things that they've achieved this term or whatever period we're talking about?
And it's actually really easy to get a good sense of that here, and also and to see how and if it's changed over this period of time. So let's take Abri for an example here, and this is her table. So you can see right away really easily we're no concerns pretty much everywhere, except physical development here, where we've got a review. Now, if we want to dig a little bit deeper into why these judgments were made, or what the evidence is here, underneath you can see there's 5 reflections that have been linked in this communication language area, and there's 6 observations that are linked as well. And we can have a little look at the timeline too. So this is what I was mentioning before, when you make that flag in your observation or your reflection. So I've clearly made an observation and I've flagged communication and language. It's linked here directly. So if I want to see the observations for communication language for Abri, I can just click on here, and here we go. Here's what I've been observing Abri doing in this area. And if I want to see more detail, I can just click there and it will take me to the whole observation. So we can sit down and we can look at this, and I can tell you this is what we did and this is what Abri did, and explain my reasoning for putting it here, etc., etc. And that would facilitate that, again, that professional discussion that we're advocating so highly at the moment. The other thing that we could look at is the reflections. Reflections, we can talk a little bit now if you want. Reflections, just a really good feature for, again, well, originally for facilitating those discussions in a more kind of, in an easier way for your staff. So you can make a reflection on anything you want, and you can flag it with those with those subject flags if you want. You can also use any other kind of flags. It can then be open for discussion with your staff or your SLT. They can add to it. You can link observations and other reflections to it to create this lovely timeline of things that you've been doing, etc. And it's really, it's a great feature, and really, like I said at the beginning, fits in with the ethos of this new document, I think. The other thing that we can look at really quickly is the timeline. So this, very simply, tells you what has happened with those judgments there. So the concerns, the no concerns, and the review. Every child starts no concerns for every area. So that's here down at the bottom here. Aubrey Jessup started with the default of no concerns in the area of communication language. That's just the default for everyone. You can see the first time this was changed was here on the 24th of September, and Kibo was unable to make a decision about this, which so they've done the review. And Stephen, do you want to talk a bit about what the review means? We've talked about it in other videos, but we can.
Yeah, I suppose it's that sort of prompt that we need to think a bit more about this. As a practitioner, Kibo obviously felt that they weren't able to make a judgment on that day when they were considering the concerns around their provision. So it might be that at that stage, a conversation across the team to gauge, is anyone else a bit unsure about how Aubrey's progressing? Or it might be that just maybe want a bit of advice from a more experienced colleague. It could be anything really.
But just talk to Aubrey more, work with Aubrey more, do something.
Yeah, it could be. This week we're going to really focus and consider Aubrey's communication, and on Friday we'll make that judgment. So it's very sort of individual to your setting how you're using that, and it's individual to the child as well, realistically, and it could mean different things in different scenarios, I think.
Yeah, and a great thing to do at that point, I think, if you're looking at the review section, is to create a reflection, because then that gives you a space, to have these thoughts and to pass these thoughts on to other staff perhaps and get their input and share that with other people. So
I think that's reflections is the one tool that I wish was available a few years ago. Because this has been perfect in my setting. And it can be anything. It can be a really temporary small thing, or it can be a more significant sort of action plan once you have addressed something and said, we've got a concern about our provision for this child. Okay, what are we going to do? And it could be something relatively minimal, like I'm going to ask a subject lead to come in and provide some advice, or it might be someone from a senior leader to come and spend some time in the classroom. It might just be, we know that this might be enhanced if we have more symbols in the room, or it could be something quite straightforward, or it might be something more significant. We're going to actually seek some outside help for this child. We've tried and we've tried and we've tweaked and we've tweaked, but so it's sort of documenting the thought process that you're going through and the considerations that you've made at different points across the year. And to have it all in one place would have been so helpful for me as a senior leader to be able to see, okay, what's Jack actually done about this? He said he's concerned or he's not sure, but and not in a judgy sort of way, but for me to learn, what are we doing for these children who are not accessing the provision as we would like them to, and just paint me a fuller picture, really. And then obviously to sit down and discuss it with you is the ideal scenario once I've had a little look at this.
Yeah, and again, you used a nice phrase there. It's about painting that picture, isn't it? So the timeline here, obviously we're going through it. As you can see, we marked review here, and then a few days, 9 days later, 10 days later, we said we still can't quite make a decision on this. So we marked review again, which is fine, because this is all, it's a working document now. This area is a concern screen. I think we can kind of look at it and it's always important to remember that overriding message that this is, you are saying you're reviewing, or you're concerned or you're not concerned about your provision, not about the child specifically. It's about your provision. So you're now thinking, right, what is it that I'm going to change? What am I going to put in place with this review button? And then we've actually made the decision here, satisfied with level of development shown by Aubrey. So this is your no concerns judgment here. And then again, reviewed a little later on, that is also, we're still satisfied with it. So whatever we've done here, whatever we've done in this review stage, whether we had a discussion or whatever it is, we've made some changes, and we've observed Abri again, we've worked with her, and now we're happy with the kind of what's happening so far with how Abri's accessing the provision in communication language. So that's basically what the timeline can show you in a kind of easy to read sort of format, and you can go through it, and again you can paint that picture, you can look at when things happened, which I think is really helpful when you're having these kind of discussions, because even knowing when it happened is a good sort of prompt, I think, to have that discussion with someone.
Definitely.
So that's the areas of concern screen pretty much as a whole here. The other things that you can do are you can export this table if you need to. You can also change the date ranges. We have the reference material down here as well, which features on your observations also, which again you can use or you cannot use depending if you need to. But yeah, I think that overall this screen is really good for painting that picture, for kind of keeping everything together in one place, and especially when if you get a chance to sit down and have that, you know, face-to-face conversation with SLT, this is just an all-round good place to be on Tapestry, I think.
Yeah, I'd say so. And it's quite simple, really, isn't it? And I think this whole process of the reforms is simplifying stuff for us, those of us working in the early years, and it's making it much more straightforward in my eyes. We are focusing on the individual children, we're focusing on what we're providing, and we are adjusting and tweaking as we go to try and ensure we can give the best opportunities we can, really. So I think it's a really positive move, and I think it should be celebrated. And like we said at the beginning, there's going to be fear, there's going to be anxiety about accountability and those sort of things, but it's a really healthy change. I think most people, and we've had loads of really positive feedback in the first few months since since a lot of settings have been implementing this. Obviously, there's been some places where there has been nervousness and anxiety about, oh, how do we do this properly? And this whole year, I think, is really going to be tweaking and adjusting how these processes look and how they work effectively. But I think in the main, people are going to really benefit from a change in approach.
I think so too. I think that's all we've got time for today. Stephen, thank you so much. It was really, really informative. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you've got any questions on Facebook, especially, feel free to add them to the comments, and we'll try and answer them when the webinar is broadcast.